Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Hurd. I'm Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you to this panel on social scientists' views of the impacts of the pandemic. The panel is comprised of SBS faculty who responded to a wide call to participate, and I want to thank them all for sharing their time and their research with us. The turnout for this event far exceeded our expectations. We have well over 400 participants, and as a result, we're planning future events showcasing how social science matters later in the summer and into the fall. Before we turn to the panel, I wanted to say a few things about how the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated rampant inequalities throughout our society. The recent protests are the latest expression of anger, not just for the horrible behavior of certain individuals, but the systemic, policy-driven anti-Blackness that courses through our society and has done so for hundreds of years, indeed 150 years before we were even a nation. As such, because it is so systemic and because it is expressed through our norms, our cultures, our laws, and our public policies, we're all implicated. Many of us are outraged, and we should all be engaged in the struggle to realize our nation's ideals. James Baldwin wrote in The Fire Next Time almost 60 years ago, "The civilization is not destroyed by wicked people. It is not necessary that people be wicked, but only that they be spineless." I'm seeing a lot more spines these days, and that can only be a good thing for peoples long oppressed and for our nation overall, but we certainly have a long way to go. I also want to note that we're going to be holding an upcoming panel on race and inequality. We have many and diverse faculty in SBS who can speak authoritatively to these issues, and you'll receive a survey right after this session asking what other topics you'd like to hear about from us. Please do let us know. We'll also send a link to some of the COVID-related research going on in the college. It's an impressive list and underscores the excellence of our faculty and the fact that social science matters. With that, let's turn to today's panel. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jennifer Lundquist. She's Professor of Sociology and Senior Associate Dean of Research and Faculty Development in the college. Jen?
Thank you, John. Before I introduce today's panelists, I wanted to thank everyone who sent in questions when they registered. We received close to 80 questions. And so our faculty panelists kept those questions in mind as they thought about what they wanted to remark upon in their opening statements. And during the Q&A period, we will address as many questions as time allows. So let's hear from our faculty panelists. First, we're going to hear from Devin Grayson, Assistant Professor of Communication. Devin?
Thank you, Jen. It's a real pleasure to be here with everyone this evening, trying to make sense out of the COVID-19 pandemic and the related uncertainty. As Assistant Professor of Health Communication, my area of specialty is health information behavior, which is a fancy way of saying I study what people do with health information and when that matters. What do people do with health information? Every day we seek information we want, or we avoid information we don't want. We assess the information we have in order to understand it, and we manage it. We also share information with others, or sometimes hide it for a variety of reasons and with a range of intentions. And of course, we use information for decision-making or other purposes. Sometimes these information behaviors don't make much of a difference, but other times they matter a great deal, both for our own personal health and the health of our families, and for health equity and social justice on a population level. So the kinds of topics I study are what information matters to people's decisions about vaccinations, or how people decide whether or not to use cannabis when they're pregnant or breastfeeding, or what happens to online support communities when someone impersonates a member, such as joining a cancer support group when they don't actually have cancer. I end up spending a lot of time scrutinizing the use of misinformation and disinformation, which is highly relevant to any controversial or difficult health topic, but has really exploded in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So just a couple definitions before I continue. Misinformation can be defined as untrue or inaccurate information that is often transmitted innocently or with good intent. Disinformation, on the other hand, is false information transmitted purposefully, often with nefarious intent, such as financial gain, political manipulation, or to sow dissent. And of course, dis and misinformation are related. In fact, some misinformation originates as disinformation, but disinformation always has a motive for the deception. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, as we've seen it unfold this far, there's been a great deal of both mis and disinformation. In English language media, there was a strong uptake in March that has persisted. For example, Early on, there were instructions for quarantining your groceries. You may have seen these. They weren't wholly inaccurate, and many well-intentioned people shared this misinformation. It probably didn't hurt anyone, and it was mostly done with good motives. But throughout, there have also been many claims about fake cures or preventions for the novel coronavirus, and these have ranged from the relatively innocuous instructions to gargle water, to recommendations to ingest potentially harmful substances. And in some cases, such disinformation has been started by people with financial motivations to create demand for certain substances, such as dietary supplements they sell. We've also seen the spread of unfounded rumors and conspiracies that are intersecting with existing biases and conspiracies. And the effect of all this has really been to pollute the information environment around the virus and pandemic, which causes confusion. It reduces public trust in evidence-based instruction, such as physical distancing, and it increases divisions in populations. It's no accident we've seen a rise in anti-Asian racism, for example. We're seeing several disinformation campaigns around COVID-19 converge with existing conspiracy and disinformation networks as well, such as those that have built around the QAnon phenomenon. And this is something we saw happen with anti-vaccine disinformation over the past 5 years or so as well. So what can we as regular people do about this polluted health communication environment around COVID-19? One thing we can do is slow down and fact check ourselves. None of us are immune to disinformation. And it's particularly easy to be duped by content that appeals to our confirmation bias, which is to say our natural inclination to read, remember, and accept information that reinforces our existing beliefs. A second thing is to follow the experts. Viruses and epidemics affect all of us, but the science is very technical. Many of us like to become mini experts on the topics of the day by reading a few articles, but we can't forget that there are actual experts who have devoted their entire careers to viruses and pandemics. And they're the voices we should really be seeking to follow about COVID-19. On the pandemic specifically, there are some really reputable journalists such as Helen Branswell and organizations to follow, and several international fact-checking efforts such as factcheck.org, PolitiFact, COVID-19 Fact Check. Some social media platforms and web search tools are trying to engage in more fact-checking, but we can't rely on those at this point. And a third thing we can do is to accept that uncertainty, while uncomfortable, is normal right now. Anyone who doesn't express a degree of uncertainty in scientific findings mere months after we first identified a completely new virus should be viewed with suspicion. The COVID-19 pandemic has created challenges in many domains: economic, educational, political. The proliferation of misinformation and disinformation has exacerbated these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. And now we'll hear from Jamie Rowan, Associate Professor of Legal Studies and Political Science.
Thank you so much. I'm here to speak a little bit about criminal justice. And I want to start by acknowledging that many of the trends we are seeing are the result of years of advocacy by those most impacted by criminal justice policies, communities with few economic opportunities, and most importantly, communities of color. This pandemic brought these inequalities in these communities into stark relief. These inequalities affect us all, including why someone like me gets the chance to speak authoritatively on this issue. An acquaintance made an important point that this moment is ripe for a social justice movement because people who have been privileged now finally know what it feels like to feel fear for our lives just leaving the house, and to know that our social and political institutions are not capable of helping us and in fact could put us in more danger. At the same time, videos show us that for others, going jogging can lead to death. Certain people can safely call the police even with false claims, and others cannot, and police being called on them can lead to a death. Our sense of vulnerability has created new opportunities for alliances in criminal justice reform. I do believe, based on research in progressive states like Massachusetts and California, that a lot of people working in criminal justice have been getting this message loud and clear, and even before the current protests. The work of activists, mainly those from the communities most affected by these policies, the work of advocates, and importantly, social scientists who have studied these kinds of disparities are bearing fruit. The change may come more slowly in other states, but it's coming. I've been studying treatment courts, which place people who have committed certain crimes and who have diagnosed mental health or substance use disorders into court-supervised treatment. My work primarily focuses on veterans in those courts, and I'm happy to talk later about how veterans are uniquely affected by COVID and what is going on in veterans treatment courts. But for now, I want to note I'm currently leading a study of all Massachusetts treatment courts and their response to the shutdown. And this is a remarkable time. Nonviolent offenders, those with parole or probation violations, are being released from prisons and jails. Police are not arresting. Those few who are arrested are being released on bail, often from the Massachusetts Bail Fund in Massachusetts, and violent crime is down. This is part of a much larger decarceration trend. The danger of jail and prison again is being shown through the pandemic, and those who thought that they were helping people by taking them off the streets now know that's not true. There are other interesting trends. In my research, I'm finding judges saying that we should not issue bench warrants for those who haven't shown up to court. Maybe we should reach out to them. I'm hearing personnel in court, lawyers taking active steps to reach out and find people who they've struggled to maintain contact with. Lawyers are not letting them flounder. Judges in Massachusetts and elsewhere have sent a message to lawyers acknowledging their role in racial disparities in the criminal justice system. This is big stuff, and I believe that many of these changes are going to last. Why? Because these are norm changes, not legal changes. And norm changes can be even more durable, and they can lead to more formal legal and political change. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. Next up is Ray LaRaja, Associate Dean for Program Innovation and Professor of Political Science.
Thank you, Jen. The impact of COVID on the 2020 elections is likely to be formidable. It will impact the voting process as well as likely winners. Pollsters like me got it wrong in 2016, and we're still stinging from the criticism. But many models used by political scientists predicted a narrow win for Republican back then. We just thought that Trump was so atypical, the models wouldn't apply. May I have a slide, please? Let me emphasize, just a second. Let me emphasize anything can happen. However, if we take the same model that predicted a Trump win, largely the three factors you see here, we can expect a Democratic win this time. On the first one, Trump's biggest argument for re-election was a strong economy, but it has fallen off a cliff. American voters tend to blame the president when the economy falters. Even if voters think it was beyond his control, he will not have a strong economy to champion. On the second point, presidential approval, Trump has had the worst presidential approval numbers in the history of modern polling. His loyal base gives him a solid floor, but he has not expanded his knife-edge winning coalition. His handling of the pandemic and reaction to the protests have sunk him to new lows with an approval rating of under 43% compared to 48% at the end of March. You don't win on these numbers. Now, on the third factor, incumbency, typically first-term presidents have big advantages using the White House to campaign and expand their coalition. Trump has not done this. He won the last election by being an insurgent outsider, but he's no longer an outsider. He really owns all that happens, and blaming others doesn't tend to work for incumbents. So can Biden, who seems unexceptional as a candidate, pull it off? Well, the cold-blooded answer is that any generic Democrat will do as a stand-in. This election is a referendum on the sitting president. In a somewhat tragic way, Biden is the best possible candidate to win. A feeling of threat often mobilizes voters. But working class whites and older voters are less likely to see Biden as a threat due to his race, gender, or policies. Some may not even vote rather than cast a ballot for Trump. Let me be clear, the Electoral College should remain close. Trump has a strong campaign operation and loyal voters, but the protests and Trump's reaction have mobilized millions of Black Americans and young people for November. In 2018, Democrats benefited from a surge in organizing by women's groups around the Women's March, and I see a similar dynamic brewing. So that's the White House. You could take down the slide. I will briefly say that the US House will stay in Democratic control, perhaps with a larger majority. All eyes are on the US Senate, where the Democrats have a 50-50 shot at taking control at this point. Some possible pickups are in Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Maine. Those are the most likely ones. Democrats may lose a seat in Alabama, so they need to win 4 if they want to take back the House or the Senate. The stakes are enormous, not just for federal elections, but state. The pandemic and the protests have shown clearly that state politics really matters for healthcare, policing, and a safety net. At least 22 chambers in the states have the potential to change party hands, and the implications are enormous. But will people be able to vote? States have been battlegrounds over voting procedures. Most experts advise a massive effort to allow vote by mail while still allowing in-person voting. Only 5 states have elections that are totally mail-in. 29 states allow mail-in balloting without any excuse. Massachusetts does not, but there is pending legislation right now to change that. The president has argued that voting by mail leads to fraud. There's little evidence of fraud, but the administrative challenges of switching to massive mail-in systems are significant, will be expensive, and involves lots of moving parts, getting addresses accurate, tracking validated ballots. I'm concerned that many mail-in ballots will be thrown out because the election administrators will question the signatures that voters write on the ballots. Research shows that ballots from non-white and low-income communities tend to be disqualified the most. So if the elections are close, I see a potential nightmare that brings memories of Florida hanging chads from the Bush-Gore election. We may not know the outcome on election night if victory hinges on a few thousand mail-in ballots in swing states. So let me close by saying it is critical for states to engage right now in a bipartisan process to decide how to count votes fairly, especially those mail-in votes. Perceived legitimacy of this election, and indeed of US democracy, will depend on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Next, we'll hear from Lenore Palladino. She's an assistant professor of economics and public policy.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for everyone taking the time to watch this discussion tonight. We are a nation gripped by intertwined crises today, and it's critical that we come together to chart the way forward. My work focuses on economic policy, particularly on corporate and financial policy, so I thought I'd make a few comments today. First, I'll discuss why a decade of seeming prosperity left many American workers so financially fragile leading up to the crisis, and what we should do to ensure economic resiliency in the future. And second, why we should use the policy of fair corporate taxation to address pressures for state and local government austerity. First, I think it's critical to establish what made American workers so financially fragile leading up to the crisis. In the 2010s, we saw high corporate profits and falling unemployment, which led to this really false sense of broad shared prosperity. But we know now that corporate profits did not mean that most workers had a financial cushion. The corporate governance framework of shareholder primacy, which is a framework that claims that the only purpose of corporate activity is to raise share prices, has meant that record corporate profits flowed disproportionately to wealthy share sellers and justified the squeezing of worker compensation over the course of the decade. We have to remember just how skewed corporate equity ownership is. The top 1% of all American households owns the majority of corporate equity, 53%. And the bottom 50% of American households owns just 0.8%, not 8%, but 0.8% of corporate equity. Meanwhile, 92% of corporate equity is owned by white households. What does this mean? What this means is that when corporations that employ millions of Americans operate with the sole purpose of increasing share prices, using that rationale to hold down labor costs as much as possible, it is disproportionately the already wealthy and white households who benefit. And I'll give you a quick example from my own research. US corporations spent $6.3 trillion with a T on stock buybacks over the course of the decade. Stock buybacks are a corporate financial tool to raise stock prices without increases in corporate productivity. But when corporate executives feel pressure and prioritize spending profits on stock buybacks, they can claim they don't have the funds to support increases in labor compensation. All of this is to say that part of the economic impact of the pandemic is from how corporate profits were distributed before the crisis. And then I'll give you a quick example from during the pandemic. It was reported yesterday that 16 hospitals that got $15 billion in bailout money are continuing to pay top executives millions in compensation, while at the same time, more than half of those hospitals are cutting jobs and hours of frontline workers. Federal bailout money has largely not come with a requirement to keep workers on the payroll. I'll be brief here with some of my suggestions for reform, but broadly, we need to create policies that move towards a stakeholder framework for how corporations operate, so that all stakeholder groups who contribute to creating the value of the corporation receive a fair portion of the benefits. Second, let me talk really briefly about another critical issue. Unless there are major actions taken, we're going to see large shortfalls in state and local public budgets. The danger is that there will be renewed pressure to embrace austerity and cut critical public services and jobs at this time. That is the absolute worst step for economic recovery. Every person laid off will reduce their own economic activity, and we could see a dangerous downward spiral in the economy. One option we have to avoid austerity and renew support for critical public services is corporate taxation. Fair corporate taxation should be part of a strategy to ensure states and cities have the resources that they need to meet this critical economic and social moment. Large corporations have seen their taxes go down for years, particularly after the 2017 federal tax reform, which reduced the federal corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, which meant an estimated reduction in $750 billion in corporate tax revenue over the next 10 years. So bottom line, we need to really think about fair corporate taxation as an equitable way to raise badly needed revenue from the entities that are least likely to change their behavior as a result of the tax. Supporting collapsing city and state budgets is a key part of the equation for surviving the pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks, Lenore. And our final panelist today is Ofer Sharone, Associate Professor of Sociology.
Thank you, Jen, and hi, everybody. So drawing on my past research on unemployment crises, I want to share some thoughts about what we're experiencing now and what's likely to come. So I broadly expect that the unemployment crisis is going to have two distinct phases. And the first phase is really now. And it's really different right now. It's different in the sense of its scale. It's huge. Even the most optimistic projections of 13.3% unemployment right now, make it the highest unemployment since the Great Depression. But aside from just being a huge crisis, there are factors that maybe surprisingly make it an easier time to be unemployed than is typical for times with that level. So first I want to acknowledge that yes, there are ways in which it is harder right now. Particularly, there are households with multiple earners being unemployed. Also, some state unemployment offices are overrun by demand, right? So those factors make it harder, but the factors making it easier right now in this first phase outweigh these by a lot. So first, typically the US has a very stingy unemployment benefit system. Typically, we replace somewhere between 30 to 50% of people's lost wages. As you recognize, most people have fixed expenses like housing and cars and kids that you can't really reduce by 30 to 50%. So what that means is usually unemployment brings about a very immediate financial crisis. But right now, because of the CARES Act that passed in March, people are getting a $600 top-off on weekly unemployment, which is putting most people at around 100% replacement rate, actually some people above it. So that's a big deal, and it makes it very different. Another way that right now is different and easier is that typically our unemployment system doesn't cover many people. And those people are now covered. So this includes freelancers, independent contractors, gig workers. They usually don't get unemployment insurance. They are getting it now. So in that sense, it's easier. And then the third thing, which besides the financial crisis, usually the other really hard thing about unemployment is the stigma that comes with it. We tend to blame the unemployed for their own unemployment. Well, right now, it's really hard to do that because the external cause of the unemployment is really clear. So we're not attributing it to individual failing. So phase one, huge, but maybe surprisingly easier than usual. I'm very worried about phase two. And that's what's starting to come. This is the phase that I think will be longer and harder. As the economy reopens, a lot of people are going to get rehired, but not back to prior levels. That's the key thing. A lot of people will still be left out. Why not prior levels? Well, you know, with social distancing, restaurants may reopen, but only partially. So they're only going to bring back some workers. Lenore mentioned the public sector with budget shortfalls. So we're likely to see layoffs and furloughs there. We're likely to see more adoption of technologies like self-checkout. All these things mean that not everyone will get rehired. But as the external cause becomes more blurry over time, I expect stigma will rise, and I expect that our generous financial support for those who are unemployed to possibly and probably maybe go away. So phase two, still large numbers of unemployed, but financially on the brink or over the brink. So, but this is, final point is this is not inevitable. We can make policy choices to avoid this bleak scenario, but the time to press for those is now, while the unemployed are still not stigmatized. So one thing we could do is push for a making of at least some version of the CARES Act permanent, so we're not so stingy. Less ideal, but also a good step would be to make the CARES Act to extend it temporarily, but make it automatically kick in at certain levels of unemployment. So this doesn't become a political football to take care of unemployed workers. More ideal still would be to provide a more comprehensive economic floor for all individuals, something like a universal basic income. So that's all my time. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for sharing your remarks. As I mentioned, we received a lot of questions. We had about 80 that came through. And so here's how we thought we would work this. We went through the questions that were sent, and those that were most commonly asked by a large number of people, we thought we would address one question from the audience to each panel member. And then once we go through each panel member, then we'll open it up. I see here in the Q&A that 10 questions have come in. So we'll try to get to those after the first 5 that were sent previously are addressed. And just a reminder to the panelists, please keep your mic off until you're ready to talk. So let's see here. Okay, here's a question that falls in Devon's domain. Devon, one of our audience members wants to know, what are the best ways that people can correct the misinformation and disinformation circulating in both their communities and online?
I think that's a question that's on many people's minds right now. Disinformation may not be worth engaging with. If someone has a reason for wanting to spread inaccurate information, they may not be willing to change that. However, misinformation, when people are sharing incorrect information with good intentions or because they don't realize it's inaccurate, then it is actually useful. People often feel like it's not useful to try to correct people, but research shows that correction does make a difference, especially if you're correcting someone that you know. So unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all way to correct false information, but there are a few principles, about 5, that usually apply. So the first one would be to use language that's appropriate to the relationship you have with the person you're correcting. So don't be really snarky with them unless you usually have an attitude like that with them, in which case go ahead. The second thing would be to build on the common ground you have with that person. So a relative, a friend of a friend, a coworker. You want to build on the common ground that you have. Like, oh, I found it really hard to keep up with all the COVID news too, Uncle Joe, but this one is actually false. I read something about it. Or, you know, I've been wondering if there's a way to protect myself too, but it turns out blowing a hairdryer up your nose doesn't help. So the third thing would be, don't repeat the false stuff. So you often see like myth and fact. Don't do that, please. Advertising works. You know, you've heard the saying, no publicity is bad publicity. Just by repeating inaccurate information about COVID-19, it can reinforce it to people, either the person that shared it or bystanders. A fourth thing would be to refer to a reliable source to back yourself up. So for many of us, that would be like the Centers for Disease Control or an article in a newspaper such as the Washington Post or something. if you're talking with someone who doesn't trust the usual trustworthy sources, that might not work as well. If you can refer to a source they do trust, maybe they don't trust the Washington Post, but they do trust Fox News. You can find an article from Fox News that says that you shouldn't blow a hairdryer up your nose, post that to back yourself up. And then the fifth thing would be, don't let it get political. Particularly if you're talking to someone who's sharing some of this more conspiracy theory tinged stuff. Folks really want to drag it into like, but what about Trump, or what about the Clintons, or Bill Gates? And it's not, don't let it get political, because then you've sort of lost the ability to correct the misinformation. Focus on the actual information that's being shared, and try not to let the conversation go into politics. Sorry, Ray.
And if panelists want to weigh in and add their 2 cents to any of these questions, feel free to do the hand raise signal on the right-hand screen. Okay, so another commonly asked question from the audience was this one. What will be the future balance between our civil liberties and disease prevention?
So I was taking this one. I want to actually build from what Devin said and note that we actually had a panel last week on COVID-19 and conspiracy theories, a conversation between me and Ethan Zuckerman that you can find at the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. And it's very useful to hear Devin's take on how to respond, because we're all sort of struggling with this. And one of the dilemmas that we were pointing out there that I think is right is when people are really anxious, and especially existentially anxious, these types of conspiracy tinged thinking gets stronger. And so coming to people with an awareness that they're scared can also, be a good way to start, which is what I found in cross-cultural conflict resolution research that I've done abroad. And that, speaks to sort of balancing our civil liberties, because we're scared. And so I wrote a book looking at efforts to redress violence during the War on Terror and how difficult it was to get those efforts in place in the United States. And, for a variety of reasons, but one of the things that was really clear at that time is people are willing to give up a lot of civil liberties when they're scared. Something I'm noticing that is really unique about this time is that most Americans do not want to give up their privacy rights right now. About half do, in recent research looking at this. And so the public health concerns, while dominant in what we're seeing in the media, are not changing people's fear of the government having your private information, and frankly, a distrust that that information is going to be used primarily for public health goals. This has been said from the beginning of this pandemic that contact tracing in the United States cannot work with the same efficacy as in other countries where people are more willing to give that information up. So I think we're in a bind there, and that actually, for people who are worried about civil liberties, I don't think I'm curious, but I'm not optimistic that we're going to be sacrificing a lot more of our privacy. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but the way that the government right now is reopening, despite the public health risks, makes me think that these concerns about sort of moving on as though we're normal are going to continue. We might get a backslide if there's a resurgence, and then people are going to be willing to give it up. But we need much better messaging by public health officials about the value of contact tracing. And that's fallen off. That was one of the most important things to do early on. That's one of the most important things that public health scholars say we need to do, and it is not being done. And it's also the most cost-effective measure. So it's a little bit confusing. One explanation is people think of contact tracing as a violation of their privacy. The other point I want to make that I think is really fascinating is that so many of these shutdown orders are not based in any formal law that gives governors and executives the right to do these kinds of orders. And so this is a fascinating moment for those of us that study why people obey the law. Because, although only one court, Wisconsin, was really willing to go and say, you know what, Governor, you don't have a right. People are following these orders, even though they're on very thin legal ice. And so, what does that mean? People are always willing to give up their civil liberties when they feel under threat. But how long they're willing to give them up is another question. And I think we're not going to know the answer to this question about how the balance is going to play out for another while, as we see the ebbs and flows of the pandemic and our medical responses and people's tolerance for the fear that they feel about the virus versus the fear that they feel that is embedded in our political culture about giving away our civil liberties.
Thanks, Jamie. Ray, this one was directed at you. It says, what is your advice for individuals and for elections administrators to maximize voter turnout in 2020, absent changes in state laws, that is?
Yeah. Well, this is mostly the tried and true stuff you should be doing anyway. The first thing is make sure people are registered, especially young people who tend to forget about this until the last moment, or they do it wrong. So registering, making sure this year that voters get mail-in ballots sent to their homes so they have choices. We've already seen in primaries that it's been very successful for turnout. So I think election administrators should be a little more forgiving about excuses people give for wanting a mail-in ballot, not just that you're ill at the present moment or out of the country. Research shows also there's no partisan favoritism in terms of effective mail-in ballots. So I think that's pretty important. I wouldn't close too many in-person stations. They've been doing that in the primaries, and it creates chaos because people don't know where to vote when if they don't get their mail-in ballot. It creates long lines. It drives up health risks, confusion. So keep some of those in-person stations open. And then lastly, just in terms of turnout, I really think people should focus on organizers should focus on getting voters to contact their neighbors directly. That is the most effective mobilization strategy, is when neighbors contact neighbors. Voting is a social act, and we do it based on things like social pressure, social norms. And so if I were trying to use whatever means, phone calls, but I would be working through people who live in those neighborhoods. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, another question that was commonly asked is this, and I'm going to direct this to you, Lenore. As small businesses reopen, what policies would reduce their vulnerability to closures?
Yeah, it's a great question. So small businesses, as we know, are critical for the US economy. They're especially critical for economic mobility in Black and Brown communities. And I think top line, what's critical for small businesses is that they receive grants, not loans, to make it through the crisis. So just a little background, small businesses actually make up a large portion of the sectors that have been most affected by the crisis. Might be surprising to some of us, but 60% of workers in leisure and hospitality are employed by small businesses. In healthcare, it's 45%, and in retail, it's 35%. We know that small businesses were far more financially fragile than large corporations leading up to the crisis. According to a recent Federal Reserve survey, only 1 in 5 firms had sufficient cash reserves to offset a 2-month revenue loss. This was a question asked in 2019. Now, of course, all the small businesses have experienced this 2-month revenue loss, and so they're in really precarious situations financially. Another critical finding from that same survey that pertains to the policy response to the crisis is that only 44% of small firms had obtained funds from a bank in the last 5 years. And that number is even higher for the smallest of small businesses. So our initial policy response, the Paycheck Protection Program, was really not optimally designed in terms of the most financially fragile small businesses accessing the funds necessary because they simply did not have the banking relationships that would facilitate quick dispersal of loans. And we saw plenty of media stories about that in the initial stage of the program. Backing up, let's remember we have an enormous hole in consumption. And as Ofer said, even as the states reopen, it's not clear that customers are going to come back. Even though it might feel, and the media might be making us feel right now like we're on the economic upswing, I believe right now and over the summer and fall, we are going to need further federal direct grant support for small businesses. And I think it's crucial that it comes directly from the government, not channeled through banks. Finally, we also need to beware of the harms of loans and the potential for an extremely harmful buildup in the debt levels of small businesses. I do some research on the new options for small businesses to borrow from fintechs, which are online lenders that are not banks. And we see really potential harm from small businesses getting so overloaded in debt that even when the economy recovers, the small businesses will collapse down the road from this debt burden. So another important part of the policy response is really regulating the ability of fintechs to lend at levels of debt and interest rates that small businesses can't afford.
And here's a question for Ofer. Ofer, what are some predictions on how the pandemic will change the future of work?
Yes. Well, building a little bit on kind of the macro context that Lenore was giving us earlier, what I'm afraid we're going to see is an acceleration of a really decades-long process of making work more precarious. Why am I expecting that? Really because employers are going to be able to get away with it. So in normal times, if you take someone's job who was secure and full-time permanent and say you're going to be contingent, there's likely going to be some pushback. Other workers will react, morale will go down, maybe bad press will come. But think about it now, as companies are slowly rehiring, if they say, hey, we can bring you back, but on these terms that are more contingent, workers are going to feel right now very grateful to have any job at all. The bigger point is that when you have massive unemployment, workers' bargaining power is very low. Employers are more able to dictate terms unless we have policy that pushes against that. And when employers can dictate terms, they're likely to push the risk onto workers. The other thing I'm expecting, equally bleak, I'm sorry, is that, some workers will be left behind, I said before, but it's not really random who's going to get left behind. We have a lot of historical data suggesting that it's pretty predictable as rehiring happens, that the people more likely to get left behind, more likely to be trapped in unemployment are African-American workers and older workers. So historically, African-Americans have—
I think we may have had a freezing situation here. So while Ofer deals with his technical difficulties, I saw that things that Ofer was saying. But Lenore, did you want to weigh in?
Am I back?
I could hear him.
Oh, okay. I couldn't. Maybe it's on my end. I'm so sorry.
Okay. Well, African-American workers are one group I expect to be left behind. Historically, unemployment rate has been double, well-known biases. I'm afraid saw a little sign of that in the BLS report that came out last week, where unemployment overall and for whites was decreasing, but for blacks actually increased a little bit during a time of reopening. That's very troubling. The other group of workers I'm very worried about is older workers. 50 plus tend to get trapped in long-term unemployment across educational levels. That's also true for African-American workers across educational levels. So this is one of the most persistent biases in hiring. I'm actually currently working on a book that might be titled Harvard Educated, Experienced, and Long-Term Unemployed, because maybe surprising, but these three factors go together more often than we might expect. So none of this, again, is inevitable. Policy can make a difference. We can have stronger enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, and hopefully also create a more economically secure floor for all workers.
Thanks, Ofer. Sorry for interrupting you like that. Lenore, did you want to respond to something that Ofer had said? I saw your hand up here.
Yeah, just to make one additional point, and I completely agree with the context that we're looking at, but I think it's really great to actually observe that as well. We've seen really an uptick in worker organizing in the last few months. We've seen incredible moments of solidarity and worker mobilization in meatpacking plants, in the healthcare sector. Walmart workers have been created their own website to track the spread of COVID and their collective demands. Their ability to use new forms of, or not new anymore, but online technological forms of organizing really do create some potential to see that bargaining power strengthen. So I just wanted to offer that observation of hope in the midst of what is, I completely agree, a really challenging generational crisis.
Okay, I'm going to move to the Q&A that was sent in during the panelist comments in the remaining time that we have left. And I'm going to ask this question. And anyone from the panel who wants to respond, feel free. Is the gap between the stock market and the real economy basically what is always going on? That wealth is less and less related to real goods? How do you account for that?
I can certainly speak to this one. That's a great question and really the subject of all my research. So we would love to engage with whoever asked it, and you can also find all of my work online. But I think many people are observing, particularly this week, how is the stock market booming when we see 40 million people unemployed? And I think it really is at the heart of it, this disconnect we've allowed for, such that corporations prioritizing raising shareholder payments, raising share prices as much as possible, and use that really as a justification to squeeze worker wages. So there's been a real disconnect that myself and many others in the economics department at UMass have studied for years over the last 40 years in the connection between the real economy, meaning the goods and services producing economy, and the financial sector, where corporations are prioritizing their financial outcomes. So what's exciting to me is I think we're in a really, even before the pandemic moment, when we had a kind of cultural and societal reckoning with this framework. You saw the Business Roundtable last year, which is the US sort of premier trade association of large corporations, came out last August and said, we're no longer going to practice shareholder primacy. We're going to practice stakeholder governance. I think that personally, I think we need public policy in place to really ensure that corporations have a level playing field. But that was a really encouraging sign. We've seen politicians from both parties, Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley in the Republican Party, many on the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Mark Warner, so all sort of sides of the Democratic Party, and certainly now Joe Biden, putting forth policies to really reshape how corporations work. So I think what this person is raising is a really important observation, one that we leave to the side too often when we say, oh, the stock market's booming, everything's great with the economy, and we're seeing that now really in a really tragic way now more than ever. So great, thanks for asking that.
Thanks, Lenore. Here's another question for you all. As a trial attorney representing injured persons, primarily injured commercial fishermen, I am concerned about the pandemic's impact on civil juries. Are any of the panelists aware of or involved in any research regarding, one, how citizens will view jury service when courts open again? For example, what are the demographics of jurors who will be willing to serve versus those who will feel unsafe and for that reason be precluded from serving? And two, will jurors now be more or less inclined to return verdicts for injured individuals versus corporations? And will the pandemic experience lead jurors to award larger sums?
I think I'm the closest person who can answer that, but I'm happy for others who know about this topic. I do not study jury behavior, but there's a large body of research on this. And I could imagine if I had gotten that question prior, I would be able to look up what type of research is going on and what past disasters have caused among jury behavior. So if you want to contact me at jrowan@umass.edu, I am more than happy to put you in touch with the vast scholarly community that studies jury behavior and civil litigation in particular.
Thanks, Jamie. Here's another question. As a high school educator, one of the biggest concerns we are facing is the widening of opportunity and access gap. What are your thoughts on how the remote learning will impact children and high school students on the whole? And what recommendations do you have to combat that gap widening? The inequities in access have already been very vast. My concern is they will grow now more than ever.
I'll just say I really share the concern of the person asking the question. And I experienced that firsthand in the spring as we moved to online learning, having certain of my college students here at UMass not having access to technology and bandwidth. And if that's happening to UMass students, which are, compared to the overall population, a more privileged group, I can imagine this is a massive problem. And, it seems to me in the scale of types of problems we could address, this is one that's very solvable compared to, say, finding a vaccine. So I hope we mobilize very rapidly to put pressure on lawmakers to help all families have access to this technology, because we're gonna need it, I expect.
Okay, and here's another question. How do workers organize when they don't come together or meet in the workplace because they're working remotely?
I think there's been incredible worker organizing really over the last decade using the new technologies that we all use to live our everyday lives. So for example, if you're interested, the organization United for Respect, which is an organization of retail workers, Walmart, Amazon, many other of our largest companies, they've been doing incredible organizing well before we knew the term social distancing, where workers from across the country were collectively building campaigns and really engaging directly with Walmart and Amazon using technology. So I think we're living in a really exciting moment. It does not at all take away from the importance of person-to-person communication when it's safe to do so again. But there's been really amazing examples over this last decade, and one I can point people to if you're interested in more is the organization United for Respect.
And here's a question that I think could be directed to either Devin or Lenore, both. How can we limit the impact of health and financial disinformation on vulnerable segments of the population?
I can start with this and then perhaps hand it over to you, Lenore. I mean, that's a very large question, and in part because vulnerable segments of the population are very heterogeneous. There's a lot of different ways that people may be vulnerable. And there's no one way to protect necessarily everyone from health disinformation. And I'm taking obviously just the health part of this. But some things we do see, for example, I mentioned I study vaccines a lot, and there's been a lot of concern about someday, assuming we do have a safe and effective vaccine for COVID-19, will people accept it? Will people get it? And really what we can do right now, for example, to try to build trust in that is to work with communities that have been alienated from governments and from medicine and from public health, to try to make sure that the concerns of those communities are being heard by the people making health policy and developing health interventions. And also so that there are sort of trusted leaders in those communities who can interpret and take messages back to their communities and be credible messengers, rather than just trying to impose health rules on the public. In terms of also, I mentioned that right now, social media and web search engines fact checking, we really can't rely on it. But there are a lot of really great computer scientists and information scientists working to improve that. And I think if they're able to improve that kind of fact checking in search engines and social media, that can also help people minimize the impact of disinformation. Lenore, do you want to take a little bit of that as well?
I would just maybe give the economist's answer on a completely different front, which is that I think that this kind of public education and public engagement requires public revenue. And so maybe just repeat my point from before, which I think also really applies in the case of education. I saw a story, I think, in the Boston Globe this morning about the wave of K through 12 cuts that are starting to happen throughout Massachusetts. And that's terrifying, not only as a person who cares about public education and works at a public education institution, but also because we know that the more that we see austerity at the state and local level, the worse and the longer the economic crisis will be. So I would just say again to the same question, I think that public support for public health is really critical for the duration of this crisis and beyond.
Okay, thanks to you both. I have one last question, and this was sent in by one of the audience members, and it is, how do we effectively respond to personal protection, for example, face coverings, becoming a symbol or a surrogate for liberal political views?
I'll take that question. I mean, you know, actions today, for better or worse, can very much be connected to our partisan identities. And if leaders make a claim, or even subgroups make a claim that one type of action is what the conservative or the liberal way, it can really influence followers. So there is a danger, and that's why it's so important for political elites to get on the same page with what's really going to be helpful for the communities in terms of health. We really should avoid politicizing, the healthcare and just basic, security of people by drawing on by trying to divide people. So, there's not much more I could say there. It's too bad that wearing a mask in some places has become so partisan. I haven't seen this occur maybe in some other places. I've heard about it in Brazil and a few places in Europe, but not to the same extent as it's been here. Maybe somebody else has some other observations on this.
I would just say it seems like we're going to need the governors again, and we're going to need to figure out, I think we have to think about government at all levels of society. I couldn't agree more with Ray that when it has to be a top down. I've studied work on peace building after war, and if there's anything that fails, it's let's teach people who survived a genocide how to talk nice to each other while the politicians continue to make their power based on fomenting conflict. I mean, it really does need to come from the top. So a question becomes, okay, are there other leaders outside of the federal government that might be able to take a stand and get some credibility on this issue? Or is it going to take yet another outbreak and the fear that people felt in March sort of resurging? I'm skeptical. I actually think it might take that, given the way that people are relaxing right now, despite public health warnings.
Okay, well, unfortunately, the time has flown by. It is the end of our time together. So I'm going to turn this back over to John. I'd like to thank the panelists and the audience for tuning in. This has been truly interesting. John?
Thank you, Jen. I too want to thank the panelists for your insights and your observations and taking the time to share them with us today. Thank you, Jen, for moderating the event. Thanks in particular to those who work the logistics behind the scenes, especially Sally Fitz and Margot Niederbach in SBS, as well as Stephanie Subbuck of Alumni Affairs. And thank you to the hundreds of participants for tuning in. I hope you can join us again for future events on this and other important topics. Please do complete the survey and let us know what other topics you'd like to see us cover through the fall. Be well and take good care.